Welcome to another Northern Monkeys video. This time we're going to talk about Space Marines in 10th edition and which detachment and units to use to get the most out of them. So first off, I wanted to do a brief history of Space Marines in 10th edition and their kind of place in the meta in order to give us some context for the units that we're going to be using later. So right at the edition launch, we kind of had the Index Marines, who came out pretty strong. Gladius is a great detachment, has some great abilities. Fire discipline in particular, even as the Codex came out, this detachment remained dominant. For those that don't remember it, fire discipline used to give you not only sustained hits, but critical hits on 5s, which is incredibly good if you could put it on a leader that also gave you lethal hits, and just almost any decent unit you could put this in would just delete all enemies. So there's a lot of that with Apothecary Biologus, leading aggressors or eradicators at various points, and deleting anything in their path. While you played a lot of efficient units around that, like the Ballistus was criminally undercosted at one point, jump pack intercessors, scouts, infiltrators, all of these units that have seen hits to their points cost used to be significant on the tabletop and really kind of defined Marines early on as a kind of super efficient army. However, all of these kind of got nerfed in various ways, eventually to the point where the fire discipline enhancement doesn't even exist as like the same thing. They've completely rewritten it. And people moved on into things like the Vanguard Spearhead. This came up, I think, after one of the World Championships. John Lennon from Art of War piloted this kind of Centurions combined with Uriel Ventris to make like a really, really hefty kind of force. Where basically, this has again been nerfed out of the game, but you had Uriel Ventris letting the Centurions deep strike. They reroll ones to hit against enemies. You can use stratagems in that detachment to get them to hit on 2s with extra AP, and they would basically just then go back into reserves, re-deep strike, and there wasn't really an angle your opponent could hide from, and you were just sort of blasting every turn with this big unit of really hard to kill Centurions. And on top of that, that detachment is still great, so it has great strats that let you move when you're charged, which is just really, really good for giving your opponent impossible scenarios where you're always going to get the drop on them. And there's also good enhancements that let you do really like strong early game pushes with like the blade driven deep. You could put that on a squad with Calgar in it, and all of a sudden he was infiltrating and just like wrecking your opponent really early on. But once again, all of these sort of took points or abilities that were nerfed or written out of the game. And while this all was happening, there was this strange rise and fall of the Space Marine sub-factions, the divergent chapters. They all came up and down, and mostly using the detachments in Codex Space Marines, as their own detachments were a little bit weaker. You had Black Templars with all the multi-melters on their tanks, getting the most out of Ironstorm and those rerolls. You had Dark Angels and their really, really strong Terminators and other elite infantry in Gladius, being really, really good. You had Wolves. They were using Stormlance to let their mounted, like big squads of Thunderwolf cavalry really, really like plow into the enemy and lock them up in their own deployment zone and be really, really hard to kill. And then later on even you had Bloodless Angels, which were essentially trying to get the most out of a changed Oath of Moment with Blood Angels. This was a really, really strange sort of set of things that happened that led to indirectly Space Marines getting nerfed in order to deal with these like weird sub-factions instead of just locking them to their own little like set of detachments and making their detachments good. So GW took notice of this clearly and decided, we're going to try and fix that. They did a pretty weird job of it, to be honest with you. They kind of buffed Space Marines with a really significant series of data slate changes. Chiefly Oath of Moment now got +1 to wound, as well as the reroll hits, which is a really, really massive boost to that. You get a bunch of AP splashed around on various data sheets, like Incursors and other kind of, not scouts, but scouty type of units with their combat knives. A lot of data sheets got rewritten, like Sternguard Veterans became a lot better. But chiefly this also gave a weird buff to like the little non-Ultramarines characters to let them give certain specialist units extra OC. It was a decent attempt by GW to rebalance Space Marines, but ultimately really, really failed and just led to a current meta that we have now. Because what they did do now was also give Gilliman the ability to pick 2 of his sort of datasheet Primarch ability things that he gets, which were always double Oath of Moment, which now had rerolls to wound, and 3 stratagems. So guess what has the best stratagems? It's Gladius. The kind of detachment lets you do anything. So it's led into this current era of like Ultramarines, Gladius being the only thing you really see inside of the Space Marine army. There are people obviously running the Divergent chapters still. There's still some good stuff being done there, and there are maybe like little sort of innovations being done with the sort of other Space Marine stuff. But ultimately, you just had this build that was all about command point efficiency, where Calgar was generating you extra command points, Gilliman was giving you 3 stratagems, maybe even a captain was giving another unit 3 stratagems, and then you just had a wall of 2+ armor save hulls, like Vindicators, Ballistas Dreadnoughts, Lancer tanks, a little bit less durable, but still in there with their good, efficient guns. And then the melee threat of Gilliman and Calgar really kept your opponent honest and let you just kind of wear away at them with these super strong units. So where does this kind of leave Space Marines? Ultimately, it just kind of feels like they're in a bit of a limbo now, where people have solved this idea of Space Marines and it's like Gilliman, Calgar, bunch of tanks, that's all you need. You just try and like wear your opponent down with like a leaf blower style build. And then there's a little room for innovation in that list because you really need a kind of critical mass to make this whole spam kind of thing work. There are people also trying out Ironstorm and the like, but Vanguard seems to have really fallen by the wayside as far as I can see, which is sad to see because it was a cool detachment and play style. And then you've got all the other Divergent chapters, Black Templars, Space Wolves just got their Codex. They're all using Gladius because it's absolutely amazing. We've seen Space Wolves winning events with that. So they're in a bit of an odd place. And obviously, as of right now, until some kind of data slate comes out, everyone is currently sort of under the thumb of Knights and Death Guard, who are really, really strong and have been for months now. So yeah, Space Marines, bit of an odd place. But there's many things we could do about that. So I want to move on to talking about detachment and unit choices for Space Marines. This is a big deal ultimately. You'll always get Oath of Moment, and if you're playing generic Space Marines, which this is the focus on, you'll get that +1 to wound, which lets you leverage a lot more out of certain squads, especially like early game trading or late game trying to like destroy an enemy unit. So there's really a lot to go on there. That's the kind of context that I'm going to talk about these units in going forward. So Space Marines are a bit of a crossroads right now. You've got tons of detachments, loads and loads of different ones to choose from. Like some Divergent chapters have like a dozen different at this point. Like I think Dark Angels in particular have just a bunch of things to go with. However, ultimately, if you're just playing your generic Space Marines, I really think the optimal choice is Gladius. It just does everything too well. There's a reason it's like the one that sees the few meta wins Space Marines get. And while there is great stuff you can do with Vanguard, I think you require a lot of like particular niche tech choices, maybe like bringing in things like Ventress, giving deep strike to certain units like maybe a Judiciar with Blade Guard, just to kind of get like a rapid ingress, heroic intervention, fights first combo going on there, something like that. People still good stuff with Ironstorm, it's still, all those holes can really like stat check people, and it can let you be more efficient into Knights with that reroll damage when you do get through their invuns and the like. So I'm going to talk about these units going forward with Gladius in mind and all the different shenanigans that gives you. So with that in mind, what do we want to get out of a Space Marine army? Well, first off, you need your damage dealers, but you also need scoring and support units to really get the most out of them. You've got to think about your early game secondaries that you can pull, late game secondaries, because on top of just killing stuff, you're going to need to be on objectives and do actions, be on parts of the battlefield. You're going to want primary objective holders and things that take primary objectives off your opponent. You're going to want little trading pieces for the early game that's going to kind of draw your opponent out and let you destroy their key units. This can be really helped by Oath of Moment, which lets certain cheaper Space Marine units punch up. And then finally, like I said, you need your big damage dealers, stuff that's going to stop like Knights and Death Guard from just running all over you. And Space Marines kind of need to do this both at ranged and in melee. They're still a relatively elite faction. You do get a lot more of them than you used to, but you need to kind of be optimizing and getting the most out of all your different units. So, my 2 top picks for early secondary scoring, we've got Incursors. Absolutely love these guys. I legitimately think that the 5 mana of Incursors is one of the best units in the game. They're pretty cheap. They've got Scout 6, which lets them kind of get a drop on your opponent in terms of deployment and the turn 1, and also lets you reach objectives on turn 1 in order to do actions. They give out a great ability, +1 to hit into anything they shoot. It's just fantastic. Even with Oath of Moment, you're not going to be able to oath every single thing in your opponent's army, so hitting on 2s with your key units can be really, really strong. And as well as that, they have sustained hits in melee, ignores covered in range, so they're always going to kind of win a trading war with your opponent's pieces. And on top of all that, between grenades and their melter mine, they can do like an average of 5 mortal wounds to anything, 7 to vehicles. Really, really strong, all for like a very cheap price. And the Lieutenant with Combi Weapon. Having access to both Lone Op and Infiltrate alone makes him good enough, as he can just get up, deny your opponent space, and then use his reactive move to get out of dodge. You know, if you keep this guy safe, you keep his ability to reroll 1s to wound against an opponent on a certain objective, that can be really, really efficient. And this guy's just a great little tech piece for keeping your opponent honest early game. In terms of scoring secondary objectives late game, this is a really important part of things. You want to, like, let's say turn 4 or 5, you draw like behind enemy lines, engage on all fronts, something like that, or maybe establish locust, and you just need to get into the backfield with a little squad that sneaks around your opponent's screens and scores you a ton of points that might win you the game. This is where these kind of units that can come in. Now obviously some of them can't come in right in turn 4 or 5, but the scouts can. So let's talk about them first. Scouts are great. They have Infiltrate and the Scout 6 rule, which basically lets them be uber safe. You know, they can deploy quite aggressively up in the midfield and then move back if your opponent goes first. You know, you should always be deploying them with the idea that you're going to get them back into safety. But the great thing about them is they get to do actions early game, they get to block your opponent in their deployment zone early game, and then if they survive these heavy duties, they can go back into reserves sort of constantly and just keep coming on from the battlefield edge, doing a bit of chip damage to your opponent with their sniper rifle and rocket launcher and scoring you points, which is a really, really like good and efficient unit to have. They're a bit more points than they used to be, but they're still great. And jump back intercessors. It's worth noting there are some cheaper options than them, like Reavers and Suppressors and the like, but jump back intercessors still do a good job of kind of coming in, scoring objectives. You know, don't forget, if your opponent leaves an objective without anyone looking at it, you can rapid ingress these guys onto an objective and just score yourself primary next turn. Could be really, really strong. But generally these guys are a great unit for coming in, doing a secondary objective, and then hopefully, if your opponent doesn't kill them, getting to move off and do a bit of damage. They can actually genuinely steal your opponent's home objective from a lot of sort of fairly decent home objective holding units, and anything light like cultists, these guys just tear right through. When it comes to holding primary objectives, we've got intercessors. These guys basically have an ability people refer to as sticky objectives, which lets them basically move off an objective and still control it, which is a really, really strong thing to do. You know, if your opponent doesn't have many deep strike threats of their own, you can just have your intercessors kind of not only hold your home objective, but then also be an additional like trading piece. And they have weirdly good firepower these days, so they got double the number of bolt rifle shots. If you're firing this into an oath target, it'll do chip damage to anything, and it'll tear up enemy light infantry. So I really, really rate intercessors. I think just 1 5-man unit of intercessors, power fist on the sergeant, grenade launcher for a bit of extra damage. They're a genuinely like decent threat into a lot of enemies, and you'll just get good value out of them if you use them right. Don't be afraid to throw them away, just use their OC to deny your opponent primaries, but at the same time they keep your backfield objective held. Really, really good. And then in terms of holding primary, this can always be tough, but don't forget, you've got your Vindicators, your Ballistas sort of hanging around if you have those units, or even just any big tank that can sit sort of butt on an objective and say to your opponent like, oh yeah, try and shift me. If you're attacking them with a bunch of melee units and a bunch of other shooting, it can be hard for your opponent to have enough resource to crack these like 2+ saves, especially if you can get cover and the like while still holding the objective. When it comes to trading, what you're generally looking for is a slightly cheaper unit that can really, really sort of like punch up and take out like more expensive units, but also walk out and kind of take your opponent off an objective, and if they all die, you're not going to be too sad about it. So I've talked about this in a previous video recently. The captain with assault intercessors, absolutely fantastic. They are really, really good at just peeling anything off an objective. The captain can get a ton of attacks and also make stratagems 3, which means you need like less investment from this guy's unit to really like wipe enemies out. And they have a great combination of volume in terms of all those chainsword attacks from the squad, and then quality, because you've got the sergeant with a power fist and the captain with a power fist and devastating wounds. This can be a unit that really trades up and tries to like take out with one of your opponent's big hitters, and then sort of die even though they've having achieved their goal. And then Stern Guard, I really think these guys are a decent trading unit. They get tons of attacks. Now this is because in melee they have 4 attacks apiece, and at ranged obviously they get all their shots for devastating wounds, and they also get full rerolls to wound into the oath target. So obviously hits and wound rerolls +1 to wound. They're just going to be mega efficient, and you can use a few stratagems to give them AP and things like that, and they'll just really, really like peel an opponent away. And as well as that, just the fact that they have full rerolls to wound and dev wound on their guns, it just means they can be always waiting around the corner to do a bunch of dev wounds to whatever your opponent puts in your face, which is a really strong and kind of a good ability and good thing to have waiting around. There's very few armies in the game that do well into dev wounds. So in terms of your damage dealers at range, there's really 2 that have come to dominate the field, and I think they're ones that they're still worth talking about. The Vindicator, if you give this guy Oath of Moment, he's re-rolling all his hits, he's got decent volume, he's got blast, +1 to wound means he's wounding things on 2s. The only thing that's swingy about this guy is the damage, which you could even, sort of mitigate with CP rerolls and things like that. And as well as that being toughness 11 and a 2-up save, it's quite a tough unit, so it won't always necessarily die after it's moved out and done its damage. I just think with its profile it's kind of nuts and can threaten anything in your opponent's army, even like sort of squads of elite infantry, has enough volume to take them down. Big tanks, obviously it has the damage to kill them. Really, really strong unit. And then the Ballistus Dreadnought. This guy's great because he's independent. He doesn't need Oath of Moment because he gets full rerolls to hit into enemy targets. So you can use his sort of round base to get good angles with his long range. He can sort of pick at enemies from relative safety and cover. And yeah, he's a great unit. He's relatively cheap, and he just gives you really, really solid firepower. He's worth having. And then just a little sub-note here. I do quite like Eradicators. I think the fact that they get the multi-melter for free now, basically get 4 pretty good anti-tank shots. They are good, but like the other sort of units you could take at range, they're very swingy. They sort of, sometimes I'll have my Eradicators rock up to like a Lehman Russ and do literally nothing because they just didn't roll any 5s to wound, or your opponent, you get 1 wound through and it's like, oh, your opponent just made that 6-up armor save. But then other times they like completely smoke like a huge enemy knight, so they're a bit of a weird one, Eradicators, but I like them. And let's not forget about the infamous grav tanks. Now, regardless of these guys' style, depending on the meta that you're in, these guys can be really, really good. You've got the Lancer, which is like a great anti-vehicle kind of piece. Really, really good into knights at the moment. You can just really get the value out of those massive shots that it does and the consistency that it has. It can kind of let you, kill one large knight with the Vindicators and then use your Lancers on another large knight. And because they have built-in rerolls, they don't sort of need the Oath of Moment to get it done. So you can threaten to kill 2 of your opponent's big things per turn. And that's true of any meta with like lots of vehicles, not just knights. And then the Gladiator, Hordes haven't been in vogue for a while now, but there are GSC running around. If you ever have any of those in your kind of local meta, the Gladiator tank will just kill an atrocious number of enemy infantry. If you put this thing into the Oath target, it can just clean up entire units. It's pretty horrendous. So yeah, meta dependent, these 2 can really come through and sort of show their specialism. Now in terms of damage dealers in melee, bit of a hard one to recommend here. You've got a lot of different choices in Space Marines, but not all of them are really that efficient. You've got the aggressors, they've got this twin link power fists. It's quite a good ability to have, a decent number of attacks and everything like that. However, they are just quite slow with only movement 5, and they're very, very fragile. T6 isn't what it used to be, and they only have a 3-up save, no invuln. They can just get absolutely picked up, and they are not cheap. You've got the Brutalis Dreadnought. You know, he seems pretty decent. He's relatively durable, has like a bit of multi-melter firepower as he goes in. But then when he does get to combat, he's only AP 2, so maybe not the best there. Blade Guard are cool. I really do like Blade Guard, and they are tough. Like, they are a really, really strong unit. But in terms of being your big melee damage puncher, they're strength 5, 2 damage to AP 2. You need to sort of do something to buff that. And you can do that with strats and things, but it's not always going to be able to like overwhelm an enemy like utterly. And then close combat terminators, or assault terminators as they're called. These guys are great with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. You know, they're very, very durable, but they're more of an anvil than a hitter, as they can really just bounce off enemy units. You need like Oath of Moment to really leverage these guys. And they can make some good plays. You know, Terminators with rapid ingress can be really, really like scary for your opponent and sort of guarantee that charge in. But they are also expensive, which is kind of like all of these units have sort of a bit of an Achilles heel in certain ways. Even though like Blade Guard are really good and aggressors can be, you know, 3 man of aggressors, maybe it's not bad. Something I need to experiment with more. But yeah, they just have a lot of Achilles heels. And with just generic Space Marines, I often find that you need to lean into an epic hero in order to get the most out of these units. And there are some great epic heroes out there. You know, Adrax Agatone, he goes in Blade Guard, gives them 4 rerolls to wound, really, really fixes that strength 5 problem. And then he himself is strength 10 with a flat 3 damage, gets his own 4 wound rerolls. Just a absolutely amazing datasheet. And Vulcan Heastan, he's getting a resculpt, maybe a new datasheet I've heard mentioned, and along with a new detachment, with some sort of a little bit of a buff of Firestorm perhaps, less focus on transports. He might, you know, genuinely really worth considering, especially in Blade Guard. I could see Salamanders like being up there, especially with all of the sort of buffs they're talking about giving to the detachment. Now, Guilliman, he's obviously amazing, but not everyone wants to run a Primarch. He's a lot of points, he kind of takes away a lot of your options. But in terms of a melee threat, he's utterly formidable. He'll just, between the blade and the fist, you know, he can hit vehicles, hit infantry. Really, really strong. And the fact that he's incredibly tough, and then when you do kill him, he has a chance to stand back up, it can just give your opponent a real problem to deal with. And then, of course, Calgar. I've made a video on why this guy's so great. He's just an absolute beat stick. His twin link power fists, all the attacks from the Vitrix Guard that are sort of escorting him around. He turns whatever unit he's in into an absolute blender, especially like efficient, tough choices like the Company of Heroes. Just really good stuff you can get out of these epic heroes if you want to play them in your Space Marines. So those were some just conventionally good units. I'll post an army list in the description if I can, but basically by just piling sort of those units together and then learning your kind of fundamentals, you can get a lot out of Space Marines, especially Gladius. But let's also talk about some of my favourite tech choices, some weirder ones that I've just been experimenting with and have got results from. So I've also made a video about this, but it's a tech choice that I saw ran in tournaments, and it's absolutely fantastic. The Gravis Captain with Artificer Armour, absolutely amazing. For those that don't know, this guy essentially runs around on his own. He has a 2-up armour save, he halves all damage against him, he has a 5-up feel no pain, he's T6, 4-up invuln. Just a really, really like annoying problem for your opponent to have to deal with. It's surprising how much stuff they have to fire into this guy. Especially with him having access to a free stratagem for himself. You can Armour of Contempt, you can re-roll a failed save, really, really good. And he's very cheap for what he does. He's essentially, I find him to be almost like the big burly twin of the lone op lieutenant. Just a really, really good piece that can stand out on primary objectives and just hold them and be like, yeah, shoot half your army into me, you know. Even those like Necron Ghost Arcs and things like that struggle to kill him. You've got the much maligned Invader ATV coming in. The reason I like this one is a mere 60 points. One of the cheapest sort of non-character Space Marine units you can get. And this guy can just be deployed early game. It can essentially be sat slightly around the corner, ready to use his fast movement of 12 to nip up and score an early secondary, or kind of block space, and be ready to kind of chip at your opponent with his multi-melter. You know, with Oath of Moment, that multi-melter is actually fairly dangerous. And this guy's only 60 points. Yeah, should be 70 points, I feel like. But yeah, 60 points. Great little unit, surprisingly tough, very efficient. Next up we've got the Whirlwind. Really like this guy, sort of classic Space Marine unit. Now I'm not a massive fan of like spamming indirect, but I do think in a certain meta context where there are Eldar running around, the Whirlwind can be a great piece. He essentially applies a lot of pressure to the enemy. By being in the backfield, having that indirect fire and effectively infinite range, it makes it so that your opponent can't really dance around you, and sort of he goes, well, that unit that's sat on an objective, I'm going to play Oath of Moment, I'm just going to completely obliterate them, doesn't matter about the indirect fire penalty. I've got blast, I've got loads of shots, I'm really consistent, I'm going to wound you on twos probably if you're like an infantry unit. He'll just do some real damage and like wipe out things like rangers, even striking scorpions, and force like sort of those little skirmishy MSU armies to come up and actually fight you on your terms, which is when you have to just put the pedal to the metal and just smash them back. Really, really good. And even like, if you're into, if you're playing in a tournament, you think you're going to see a lot of Eldar, but that you don't. This guy in Gladius is actually still fantastic, just for being able to go, oh yeah, indirect fire, what does that give me? Oh, -1 to hit, only hit on 4s, your opponent gets cover. Oh, well, I'm going to use Oath of Moment, so I'm re-rolling all my hits. I get +1 to wound, so I'm likely wounding things on 3s or 2s. Oh, and I can also use a stratagem to get Ignores cover, an extra AP. It just means that he'll do serious damage into almost anything that has Oath of Moment on it, and I think even though his damage might not actually be that great, the psychological effect it has on your opponent can be quite good. And then lastly, suppressors. If you can actually get a hold of this unit, then go for it, I think. 75 points, they're like very cheap, and it's because there's only 3 Marines in a unit, but it kind of doesn't matter because it's 75 points, it's just more efficient than something like the Assault Intercessors with jump packs. They have a slightly smaller footprint, so they can fit in kind of like funny little triangles in the back where your opponent maybe doesn't have units like perfectly overlapping from each other, so you can score those secondary points. And their guns aren't bad, especially if you're sort of trying to do chip damage into the Oath of Moment target. They'll really, really like do a decent amount of damage there. It can be quite surprising. And then whatever they have shot as well has -1 to hit. It's not like the greatest thing in the world, and like sometimes if you're not going into the Oath target, you just sort of blast whatever you want with this and do a bit of damage, but then also just -1 to their hit rolls. It can nerf some certain units quite significantly, especially things like Guard, who traditionally might hit on 4s. So yeah, I really rate the suppressors. They're just impossible to get hold of, unfortunately. A lot of talking in that one, but thanks for watching if you've made it through. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. We try and make content like this on a fairly regular basis. And yeah, this was just based on a comment from a viewer just about how you kind of build a Space Marine list. I think one thing that's important with them is just to get good, fundamentally strong data sheets where you can out of the Space Marine Codex. There's so many to choose from, it can be kind of overwhelming. And there are loads of great ones that I didn't even talk about in this, I do rate Infernus Marines. I think I'm definitely going to do a video on that new Salamanders detachment when it comes out, because Infernus Marines that can advance and action and still shoot are really, really strong. So we'll have to see. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this gives some people some ideas about the kind of core of what their Space Marine list can be, and then you got the confidence to kind of experiment from there and know that like you're always going to be able to put up a good fight. And maybe you want to try out the new, you want to try Shrike or something like that in your list.